Video filters. It's Easter.
There you go.
Be Eastery.
Oh, let's both do it. Hold on, where's mine? Here we
That's
are.
under video filters, and I chose the bunny. Look at that.
Hi. Yay. I think we should do the entire episode like this. We're going to talk about sex.
But it's going to be really hard to have an honest conversation.
We're going to be dressed like Playboy bunnies, and we're going to talk about sex.
To this extent, this is the extent of my Playboy bunny.
All right, we'll fix this. I can't do this.
All right, let me get it off.
No, I don't need auto.
Back to none.
Right.
Real talk, messy faith, a lot of grace. This is Untangling Faith podcast with Tammy and Laura, and we are so glad that you're here.
That's right. All right. So it occurs to me that we've been starting our podcast without introducing ourselves, because if someone's jumping in at the last name, our names are in the corner, but we can go ahead and introduce ourselves. Tammy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. I'm Tammy Jackson. I am the senior pastor at Anniston First United Methodist Church in Anniston, Alabama. I've been in ministry with the United Methodist Church for about 20 years or so. I've been married to my high school sweetheart for around 33 years and have 2 grown adult sons, 1 daughter-in-law, and a grandchild on the way.
Yeah. I am Laura Hutchinson. I am an ordained pastor in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and I'm serving a church in, did you say which church you were serving?
Yeah.
The First Christian Church in Anniston, Alabama. And I am not married, never married, but I do have a daughter. She is adopted, an adult adoption. She came into my life when she was 21. She's 28 now. So, and I have my lovely son-in-law as well. So no grandkids yet. And anyway, that's where we are. So we are talking about, this is a subject that we've talked a lot about because it's come up in other subjects, like talking about abortion and things like that. But we're going to just talk about it very specifically. Let's talk about sex, baby. Let's talk about you and me. We're going to talk about sex in the church. And the reason I got the idea for us to talk about this week is I was going through my notes on my phone. I'm going to pull it up so I can read it to you exactly. I saw a billboard on 202 coming back from Jacksonville, or 221 coming back from Jacksonville. And it said, it's a billboard that said, "Shackled by lust, Jesus is the answer." And I felt compelled to write that down because I am struck by the number of times that we hear Christians talking about the sin of sex, I guess, and an obsession with sex, apparently, and an addiction to sex. Mm-hmm. And kind of curious about that. I don't really understand why. Maybe we should have had somebody in who was an expert on that. I don't know, that might be asking too much for somebody.
And we can look at that in the future. We'll see what feedback we get from this conversation, and it could be appropriate for us to bring somebody in who works in that area.
I don't know. Have you noticed that kind of obsession with that in certain branches of Christianity?
I do know that when it comes to talking about Christians and sex, we hear all these odd kinds of statistics that come out and things that people tell us. For instance, when there's a Christian convention in town, the pornography access in hotels goes through the roof. And there are a lot of people speculate about the reasons for that. One of the reasons may be that it's a way to access it that they don't think they'll get caught. They're not bringing it into their home. Nobody's going to find it on their computer. Their kids aren't going to stumble across it. It's not a magazine under the mattress, those kinds of things. The other thing is that there are some people who think it's a curiosity. I'm hearing all about that, but it's not something I do. But while I'm anonymous in a way, let me check that out. So I don't know if it's a way to access it more or the curiosity, but I have heard a number of times that statistic that when there are Christian gatherings that the pornography access on the TVs in the hotels goes through the roof. I know that I heard a lot growing up about sex and about being careful about sex, about never accessing porn because you didn't want to become addicted to that. It was highly addictive. I was always told pornography was more addictive than cocaine or meth. And so there were all those kinds of messages. And so I do know a lot of churches are trying to help people who don't have a healthy view of sex in their estimation. I just don't agree with the healthy view of sex that most of them have.
So my perception is it depends on just really as an outside observer, because within my denomination, I've talked several times, and I'm sure I'll talk about it a lot today, but my denomination, we do tend to talk about sex pretty openly to kids, as far as how did God create you and who did God create you to be, and to respecting your body and respecting your partner's body and all of those kinds of things. Anyway, I'll get into that more. But I've never been taught that sex was bad. I was taught that sex before marriage wasn't good for you, that it wasn't good for you, but not that it was evil or dirty, or that people should be shunned, or that it was something that was going to destroy your life. Or I never thought about it. I never heard that. But as I've gotten older, I've noticed that there are different ways that different traditions talk about it. For example, the Catholic Church, and please correct me if you're Catholic and you want to chime in, because that's valid, because I'm not a Catholic. But obviously, priests and nuns don't have sex. They're abstinent. They take a vow of abstinence. And then they view sex, at least historically, as a way to procreate. That's the purpose of sex, is to build your family. And that they have historically discouraged birth control. They have definitely discouraged abortion, or are against abortion and things like that. And so many babies. So it was always, my mom always joked that the Catholics in her neighborhood had 10 kids when she was growing up. But then there's the evangelical church that I've noticed is really focused on sex. So one time I did a deep dive trying to find out what it was that accountability partners were for. I was just curious. I'd heard about them and didn't know what that was. It's not a part of my tradition. And the only thing I could find on the internet, I found like 3 or 4 websites dedicated to training accountability partners. And the only training that was included on these websites, at least open to a visitor or guest like me, was not watching porn. That was the only thing that they were being held accountable for. And I was kind of dumbfounded by that, because that is not my issue. But maybe it is some other people's issue. But why does it seem to be more of an issue in the evangelical church than in my church? Maybe my church just doesn't care, but I don't think that's the case. I don't know. So that's one of my curiosities here, is about how we in the church talk about sex, how we view sex, and maybe even what the consequences are for the way we talk about sex.
Yes.
What does the Bible say about sex? Of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
I made notes.
Start with that.
I did a little research and was looking at it. Let me say this. I've been pretty clear that I grew up in a different tradition than I actually serve in. I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church. And I personally, in my own growing up, did not get a lot of the toxic messages. I mean, my home church was not really a bad place to be. Now, it was conservative. And I did hear the double standard that is very pervasive out there. The emphasis was really on, when we talk about purity, the purity was the girl's responsibility. The girl should be pure until she got married. And there were a lot of not really great messages around that, including everybody wants to marry a virgin. And so if you're not a virgin, you're like tarnished goods. Your husband's not gonna, if he finds out that he's not your first, he may not want to marry you. He'll lose respect for you. He will treat you worse if you are not his first. The purity culture that has become such a big thing was not yet a thing when I was growing up. So I grew up pre that. But I do remember being struck by the idea that if the biblical standard is no sex before marriage, why do we look the other way? Why is it, well, boys will be boys, and it becomes all the women? Even as a teenager, it bothered me that the length of our shorts and the width of our straps on shirts were policed to keep the boys from stumbling. And it took me well into adulthood to realize that if women are supposed to be the weaker sex and men are supposed to be that strong, why is it that they can't control their sexual urges? You see something that may excite you, it doesn't mean you have to act on that. So it's been a whole, I didn't grow up in a toxic environment. I just grew up in the typical double standard of that. But I have some real issues with the way it gets handled within the larger Christian community. because I am convinced that the desire for sex, and sex not just for procreation, but for pleasure, for intimacy, and for connection with a partner, is part of God's creation and design for us. And when we suppress and the appropriate expression of that, it comes out in inappropriate ways. And that explains some of the issues that we have with the mistreatment and the exploitation and the devaluation of people.
And I'm wondering if there is a correlation between the way a Christian movement, or you called it streams, how one stream or whatever, or tradition talks about and views sex, if there's a correlation between their views on sex and the propensity for abuse within the movement. Everybody was shocked, but maybe not super surprised when it came out a few years ago that there were all these cover-ups in the Southern Baptist Church. And this is I noticed that there were critics of the Southern Baptist Church just sort of gleefully going, oh, you're so pious. Look at you. Oh my gosh. Oh, what hypocrisy. And I can understand it, because there's a lot of preaching coming out about the poor, you sinner. And then the one preaching the sin is the one committing the worst of it.
And I think that's what caused a lot of the anger for people, is that while you are preaching purity, it's turning out you're not practicing what you're preaching. And so you're not being authentic and genuine. Because that's the denomination I was raised in, I printed that report, was 200 and something pages long. I printed them all out. I read every word of that. And there was no celebration for me in that, either for the victims, because there were a lot of them, or for the perpetrators. I just cannot celebrate that people who are supposed to be ministers, who are entrusted to shepherd God's people, were preying on them. We don't have enough to face in life, not being able to trust. There is a girl that I follow on TikTok, and I struggled for a minute because she made some statements about, let's normalize leaving the church. In her opinion, anybody who is a good parent is not taking their kids to church. Well, that of course got my attention, and she did several videos on it. Her reason was, your kids are in massive danger from youth ministers and preachers molesting them, abusing them, seducing them. Stop. If you're a good parent, you are not putting your kids in that kind of situation. Well, I don't agree with her.
Right.
Because I still think it's a small fraction of the churches, but I do understand where she's coming from. All the things we're worried about, church is not the place where we ought to be worried about that.
Right.
And I don't know, you mentioned how your denomination handles this. I will admit that I don't know that much about how the United Methodist, we don't talk a lot about sex. I would be really surprised if you ever heard most United Methodist pastors do a sermon series on sex or sexual attitudes in a Sunday morning worship. Probably classes maybe, but I know a lot of evangelical pastors will do marriage series or series, and they'll talk about this, and that wouldn't happen much in my church. But I don't know about children's curriculum or confirmation curriculum, and I probably should, but I don't. I probably need to look that up and see.
I don't think you'd see that coming from the pulpit in my denomination much either. Maybe, especially if it was an issue or a topic that was relevant to that congregation, just like his letters were written because what he says was relevant to the issues in that congregation. A lot of sermons grow that way as well. So maybe there, but it's not common. It's not.
And I do know that.
Well, it's not like in our denomination, we don't have sex scandals. It's not that we don't have pastors who cross the line and we find out that they've been predators against children or other women in their churches or something like that. That it happens, of course, but not proportionally, not at the same rate or in the same amount as some of the more rigid denominations, the ones that are more rigid on their stance on sex and things like that.
And our denomination as well, this has had some scandals. I've known of some personally. And I cannot say, I'm not naive enough to say that nothing has ever been swept under the carpet or that we've never turned a blind eye. I can't say that because I would not know what has happened in every church and every conference in the United Methodist Church around the world. But I will say our official position on those kinds of things is that it is celibacy in singleness and faithfulness in marriage. That is the standard that we are expected to live up to. And it's expected not just of clergy, but also of people in the congregation, particularly of people who are leaders in your congregation. And I think the reason you don't quite hear the kinds of scandals in the news is, at least I hope, is because we don't sweep it under the carpet. We have a process for addressing it, and it's not okay.
Yeah.
And we don't treat it like it's okay, and we don't look the other way. We have something called safe sanctuary policies, which mean children and vulnerable adults. There are policies for not being alone with an adult, for there being two non-related adults. We don't put one child in the car together. We don't stay in the same rooms at retreat centers or on mission trips. And we don't have one person leading a group. There's safety in numbers, and we're doing what we can to do ministry and try to protect those among us. Do we succeed 100% of the time? I'm quite sure we do not, but I do think we are trying. It is our heart's desire to not see people hurt, particularly in the area of sexuality in our church.
For us, clergy in my denomination, I'm assuming we have to do it in every region, but definitely in every region I've served in here, we've had to do what we call boundary training every 5 years or so, or more. I'm not sure, 5 to 10 years. And so clergy has to go through this every time, and in order to maintain our standing in the denomination. And what that does is it teaches us all of the ways basically to avoid a scandal, really. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to, but also how to avoid even the perception of a scandal in order to protect yourself and the church, but then also how to set up safe church policies within your congregation so everybody is safe. So you're protecting the child care worker from an accusation if you're doing that, and you're protecting the child from the possibility of abuse. I don't meet in my office with a man especially, but also with a gay woman. I don't meet in my office alone with them if I can help it. I have a glass window in my door that I uncover when I'm doing one-on-ones in here. But most of the time, I'll be honest, I choose to do a one-on-one out in public. Now, people may think, boy, that Laura, she sure does date a lot. But I'm not dating. I'm consulting or giving pastoral care or meeting with or doing Bible study or something like that, one-on-one with another member of my church in public, because that's the safest thing for both of us. If they have a spouse, they know that we're doing it. It's all above board and whatever. There's no clandestine meetings or anything.
Yes.
So
I'll give you an example. My church owns a camp, and our camp director is male. And we met on Sunday afternoon. We went to the camp office and sat across from a table with each other. I would not have met with him at his home in his residence. Now, I would have had him to my house when my husband was here. So there's just those kinds of wisdom. We do a clergy ethics training. I think we're supposed to do it once every 5 years. COVID messed us up on the years, and so I don't know where I am. I'm assuming the conference will tell me when it's my time to do it again. But one of the things we talked about was this idea of sexuality and what's going on has been used sometimes as an argument against having female clergy in our churches, against having female associate pastors working for male senior pastors, because they can't really work together. If they spend too much time in an office working on something, people begin to talk. They can't go. I had a friend who could not ride in the car with her senior pastor to a conference or district meeting because people would talk about that. And Billy Graham is well known for his rule about never being alone with a woman. A woman could not pick him up at the airport. If you push that too much, you inhibit our ability to do our job.
Right.
In a lot of my churches, meeting with a parishioner on lunch for coffee, to grab a breakfast or a snack, that is a primary way of doing business and building relationships. And if I can't ever do that with someone who is of the opposite gender, then I can't do my job.
Right.
But when we go for coffee, we can sit at a table and talk up front near the window we won't cozy up on the couches in the back of the coffee shop. There's just wisdom. If I'm going to meet somebody for lunch or a meal, I'm not going to a dimly lit steak house to meet them. I'm going to go somewhere that is well lit and open. So there's wisdom in that. I, however, do think that some of that is our bias against this idea that women and relationships are dangerous. I have lots of conversations with people about, can people of opposite genders be friends, genuine friends? And yes, I think they can. Some of my dearest friends are male. We don't go camping together. There are boundaries.
Hotel room.
But God has brought some really wonderful friends to me who do not share my attraction or do not share my gender. And to make that off limits just because of those things, I think, is to reject a blessing and a gift from God. We just need to be wise about it.
Yeah. Well, there are other things too when you're talking about, of course, child abuse and things like that. Talking about the woman who says, "Don't take your children to church." I had a mom in my church say one time, and I may have said this already I can't remember, but anyway, that she would happily let her kid run around in a drag show, but alone. But she would not consider letting her kid run around alone at their church until they came here, which is nice to know. But that was nice to know. But I've said that to people, and conservatives are like, "Oh, what?" And of course, there's the perception that drag queens and transsexuals and whatever, they're all just predators and child abusers. That's the only reason that they dress up, because they want to abuse children, right? But the reality is, statistically speaking, your kid has way less of a chance of being abused around 20 drag queens than they do around 20 Christians.
And that's
terrible.
It hurts my heart to even say it.
It hurts the body of Christ.
It does.
And I think that we need to do better, but I also think that there's a reason for that. And it's got to be the way we're talking about sex, the way we address it, the way we approach it within the congregation, and that sort of thing.
I agree.
And
so when I
or gay people or trans, it doesn't matter your orientation or your attraction. How do we talk about sex in a way that is healthy, Christ-like, biblical, and not going to push people into doing things that are going to hurt them and other people?
Yes. When I did a little research and I went back to our creation stories in Genesis, the beginning, because those stories are designed to tell us this is how God created us to be. Basically, the way I see scripture is we get a story of how God created the world and how God wanted it to be. Then we break the world. And the rest of the Bible is God trying to help us come back. And that then Revelation is the celebration of the story that in the end, God wins. And eventually, things go back the way God wants them to be. There's just a lot of messiness in the middle. So I also believe that scripture contains examples for us to follow and examples of cautionary tales. So just because something is in the Bible doesn't mean it is something to be emulated, repeated, and held as a principle forever. And when it comes to sexuality, I think we have both. I often cringe when we start encouraging third, fourth, and fifth graders to start reading the whole Bible from beginning to end, because there's some of that stuff. There's a lot of PG-13 and there's some R in there. There's even a little bit of X in there. Even this year, our congregation is reading through scripture together. And Gabby, who works with our youth, was like, the youth were going to read. And I went, be prepared. When we get to the end of the book of Judges, when we get to the Song of Solomon, be prepared to have a conversation about that. Some of that is not pretty in there, but isn't that real life? That life is messy, and this whole idea of sex is not so cut and dried.
Right.
It's messy too. But in the beginning,
hold on.
God created.
Wait a minute. Lucy, it's Bring Your Terrorist to Work Day. I have my dogs with me today. Lie down. We'll see if that works.
Just so I can't hear her.
Oh, good. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I just if it makes you feel better, I don't hear it at all. But I believe that God created our bodies good. And I believe he created sex to be good. And so it's not wrong. Sex is not inherently sinful. it is good. And I do believe it's for more than just procreation. Sex is wrong when it is exploitative or manipulative. And much of the way the church has talked about it over time has been both of those. I'm not a huge fan of some of the Old Testament where if a woman is raped, she marries the rapist. No, let's not do that. But they just didn't draw the same lines we do about that, or that we should in there.
But that also comes from that's addressing the cultural problem, at least attempting to, which was that once a woman had sex, she couldn't get married. Whether it was
Yeah.
consensual or not, she was ruined, right? Which is another
Mhm.
problem. And
Or
then,
the idea that the sex itself was the marriage. In the Old Testament, the way people got married, there was an arrangement made between the parents. There was a preparation time, and the groom shows up, gets his bride, sleeps with her, married.
exactly.
There was no legal document. There was no church. That it was an arrangement that was enacted and consummated by the sexual act. So by him having sex with her, even forcibly, he had just married her.
Right. Well, and then there's the other piece where if women didn't have a husband or a father, then they essentially couldn't function in society, which has been a reality for women all the way up until the 1950s or the 70s. Yeah. When was it that women could finally start signing loans for themselves or getting credit cards?
That was either in the late 70s or the 80s. It's been real recent to me.
Yeah. So someone just came. I got an alert. Someone just came in the church, says the dogs may start barking again. But anyway, so there was a lot of stuff that happened to women back then, and that a marriage would protect her legally anyway, right? So if she's married, she's got someone to take care of her. And if she's used goods or whatever, or if she's legally married to another man or whatever, she can't marry anybody else. So she's either out on the streets on her own from here on out for the rest of her life and no one to take care of her, which is where the taking care of widows thing comes from, because they had no other way to care for themselves except through the charity of others. But I think they thought they were doing the right thing, because then, well, if you're going to break it, you keep it, which is, anyway.
Yeah. But I also, when I look at scripture and really sit with it for a minute, I'm not even sure that the way we treat that, because we say 0 sex before marriage, broken, used goods after that nobody wants. A lot of evangelical churches have taught if you get divorced, you cannot remarry because that's committing adultery. And they hold that kind of hard line. But when we look, Moses is the one who allowed them to divorce. And then there are boundaries put on that. You can't divorce this woman and she marries this one and then divorces that one and marries this one and then you take her back. We don't pass women around party favors, even in the Old Testament. And I think when Jesus talks about divorce and remarriage, what he's saying is that we should treat marriage like it is important. We are at our most vulnerable when we are naked with someone, when we are in the throes of that act. We are incredibly vulnerable, and we should be able to trust that person and not be afraid of what's going to happen to us. And I think Jesus is saying, stay with the wife of your youth. He's echoing the prophets of the Old Testament of saying, we grow and we change. And it's not just about her physical appearance. It's not just about her childbearing ability. She's going to have bad days and attitude. And there's days she's not going to like you much either. But we don't cast people aside because they're not meeting our needs at the moment. We don't divorce people lightly. When we bond and become part of a family, stays together. So I don't think he was forbidding remarriage, because I don't think not being able to make a relationship work means you must be sentenced to being alone and lonely for the rest of your life. Because I think the grace of Jesus just tells us that the world is grayer than that and harder to live in, and we get to learn and grow and go forward. I just don't see much evidence that one mistake and it's all over, you get no other chances, but that we are supposed to treat it seriously and we are supposed to be faithful to what we do. And I think that's the point that he's trying to make.
I had someone tell me, we were talking, I don't know how this came up because he was a relative stranger, but we're talking about the Bible. We're talking about somehow sin came up. And it was actually kind of an interesting conversation because we were debating what is sin and why is something a sin. And it's not just a sin because it's a sin. And it's not whatever. We've talked about this last season. But he said, well, because obviously if you think about having sex, it's the same thing as having sex. You've committed adultery against your spouse or against your future spouse. And I said, well, but think about what it is that is, I mean, why is something a sin? A sin is something that goes against God or is unloving towards your neighbor, right? So if you have lustful thoughts towards somebody else, it might be disrespectful for one thing. If you're thinking about somebody as if they are just an object to ogle, then that's not loving your neighbor. But also, if you're married, would it hurt your spouse to know that you're fantasizing about somebody else? Now, and then I went on to clarify, if you see someone who walks by and you find them attractive and you go, ooh, that guy's good looking, or that woman's beautiful, I don't think that's a sin. I think that's just your eyes connecting and having a thought. It's when you sit down and start to entertain where things could go from there, and you start to fantasize and you start to really spend some time with that. That's when it becomes a sin. We don't have to beat ourselves up because we notice someone who is attractive. We'd have to, that's insane.
That would be natural. But scripture also tells us to take captive every thought. So we pay attention to, we didn't just notice, we're beginning to wonder and to want to notice and see more. Now we're in a situation where it'd be better to stop it there. That's why when Jesus talks about getting angry and not murdering, because it starts with the thought that we don't take control of, and it progresses into an action that is hurtful and harmful.
We call those intrusive thoughts these days. The thoughts that just sort of like pop in that are inappropriate or whatever.
It's the intrusive thought.
Exactly. But you catch the intrusive thought itself is not the problem. It's the entertaining the thought from there and letting it just run its course is the problem. Because then in your mind, you've completely disrespected another human being. You have disrespected your spouse if you're married and that sort of thing. That's what makes it a sin. And so that kind of comes into the way we talk about sex with our kids in our denomination. And it's about respecting the other person as much as you respect yourself. Is this something where you see that other person as being of value, a person of worth, a child of God who deserves to be cherished, male or female? It does not matter the gender of the person that you're attracted to. If you're a male and you're, it doesn't matter who you are or who they are. Are you respecting them as the created, beloved being that they are? And their humanity and their beauty and the fact that they are cherished by God and all of that kind of thing. I think that's where you start with it. Problem that I have with porn is not that you're looking at sex. It is exploitative of the woman, and it perpetuates a culture of exploiting women. I know that there are lots of women who do it very voluntarily. They say that they are fully consensual. They like it. They like their jobs. Fine. The problem is that if that's the case, I'm willing to bet the majority of the people who are involved in the actors who are creating porn, if they thought they had any other options to make the same amount of money that they think they need, they would choose something else. I suspect that that's the case.
I think the money is an attractor. I also think for some of them, it is rebellion for liberation. I will break free from the chains of being told that I can't be a sexual being. And sometimes when we push back against something, the pendulum swings too far in the other direction.
But
I know that
it's still exploitative. And a lot of it perpetuates rape culture. A lot of it perpetuates the idea that women are to be looked at, that they're sex objects, and that's it. And all of that. And on top of that, it is addictive because it creates a dopamine bump or a rush.
And one of the things that's happening, there's been a move, and which may be part of what you're seeing with like accountability partners, and because it becomes really easy for porn will come to you if you have the internet.
Right.
My younger son, who is a computer whiz, it was like his first computer. He had a Yahoo email, and he came and got me one day, and it is just this flood, window after window, popping up and opening on his screen. And it was all porn, and figuring out how to get that off.
That
I think they
happened to
call
me
it a
at work.
waterfall. So, but it will come to you. And so there are people who are saying, help me not ever fall for that, because you can learn, things can begin to turn you on, and you will associate those with sex and pleasure that are unhealthy. And then these men are struggling to be in a healthy relationship with a real live, normal woman without those unreasonable expectations of eroticism and response and appearance and those kinds of things, because that's what they have been acclimated to.
Right.
And
And
so a lot of those anti-porn programs are designed to help you begin to be aroused appropriately by appropriate things.
by your partner, your spouse. Yeah, I know a lot of couples where the husband has become addicted to porn and therefore can no longer perform for his wife without the porn. And the wife is demoralized by that. It starts to interferes with their intimacy and all of those kinds of things. And it can be death too. It's essentially cheating on your spouse, is what it feels like, I think, from what I've heard to the other person. And I don't know, all of that is problematic. I wonder why. I have no idea if the men in my denomination are obsessed with porn or not, because we don't talk about it. And for all I know, they're going home and watching it every night. I don't know. It seems as if the evangelicals talk about it a lot more than we do. But it seems to me that there's more problems with it, and as also with the other stuff, with the straying and the promiscuity and all of those things. What's the word I'm looking for? Predator behavior in the more rigid movements, in the more.
It certainly does feel that way when you hear the statistics. The more restricted and suppressed a natural sexual drive is, the more scandal that the groups have. Now, the answer is probably not to go the other way and make everything sexual, and that too is a problem. But we were talking about the men and getting addicted to the porn, and that interfering with their sexual response. The other side can be true for women. When girls are raised in purity culture, that their virginity is equal to their value. Their worth as a human being, as a future wife, mother, adult woman in the church, is in their purity and their virginity. Then they get married, and they're supposed to suddenly become these incredible and wonderful sexual beings with their husband. And a lot of women cannot flip that switch, and they struggle. It still feels wrong to be attracted even to the person that they have married. And particularly when they have children and they begin to see themselves as a mother, we go back to this Madonna, this Virgin Mary idea that virginal equals better mother than sexual being. A lot of women struggle with that. They struggle with the fact of, I don't want to have sex with my children in the next room, particularly if the child is young and is sleeping with them. I was told you should never do anything in front of your children that your children cannot be involved in. And some people think that's a great standard. You don't want your children to walk in on you having sex, but there are appropriate ways for a husband and a wife to express affection for one another, even in front of the children, that are not appropriate for the children to engage in with one of the parents. So,
Right.
But we become so complex, and it becomes so tangled up. That's what I was thinking, was this episode could be calling Untangling Sex from all of the cultural stuff.
Thanks again for hanging out with us on Untangling Faith podcast. Come back next week for the rest of our conversation on sex in the church. Like what you heard? Click the thumbs up, subscribe, leave us a review, and tell a friend, especially that one friend who always has opinions, and you know who they are. We'll be back next week with more holy chaos.